Are we half past? Yeah. Must be, yeah. Welcome to our final Irish Studies seminar for this semester. So we're having our large annual lecture at the end of May, and we'll be circulating you all on the details of that, after which we'll be having drinks and food. So we hope you can all come. It's a great honour to welcome here today Niall Carson from the University of Liverpool. And it's nice to see that he got the opportunity to meet old colleagues, Diane and others with whom he's worked in the past. The title of Niall's talk today is The Gates Flew Open, Peadar O'Donnell, Communism and the Irish Academy of Letters. So Niall is Joint Patronage Lecturer in Modern Irish Literature at the Institute of Irish Studies in Liverpool. He's published on topics such as Irish print cultures, working class poetry, transnational Irish literature, and he's written an important book called Rebel by Vocation, Sean O'Fuelon and the Generation of the Bell, a topic of perennial interest. He holds a PhD from the University of Liverpool. In addition to this, he holds degrees from the University of Hertfordshire, the National University of Ireland in Cork, the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. He's worked at Liverpool Hope University, teaching English literature and education, and also as a lecturer in the University of Manchester before returning to Liverpool to take up his current position. He is at Liverpool Department Lead for Postgraduate Research, and he's currently working on a project, part of which he's going to give us an insight into today, on the ever fascinating Irish Academy of Letters, which I look forward to learning more about. So Niall Carson, The Gates Flew Open, Peadar O'Donnell, Communism and the Irish Academy of Letters. Thanks so much, Niall.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. You know, where so much excellent scholarship has come out of Institute of Irish Studies here, so I'm delighted to be here. I'd just like to open up, I suppose, with a bit of an apology, because I won't really be talking about anything that I mentioned at the top. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a trial, one specific trial, the trial of Peadar O'Donnell for a libel trial in 1932, and try to draw some conclusions from that, and what specifically happened, and the ways in which we might want to think about O'Donnell as a figure, but the Red Scare election, for example, in 32. Okay, so in April 1932, the very Reverend H.V. Casey OP opened his editorial in the Irish Rosary with a section on the value of advertising called The Art of Publicity. It also contained a segment that criticised Trinity College Dublin for hosting a debate on euthanasia, and another section that condemned the newly formed left-wing Republican group CRR. In a piece titled The Broad Road of Trinity, he rather stridently claimed there was one notable omission in the register's category of destruction of the unfit and diseased. Trinity College has been notoriously unfitted for Ireland, and its ethos has been and is a malignant miasma. Then why was it not argued that euthanasia should be applied to Trinity College, and dynamite is God-given too? He was taking CRR to task for its members trying to maintain that they could be Catholics in good conscience, despite there being a recent joint pastoral from the Bishops of Ireland denouncing its membership. According to the editorial, the aim of this organisation included the setting up of an anti-God state, and ultimately the creation of a communist party to rule Ireland along the lines of a subservient Soviet republic. More specifically, the editorial focused on Peadar O'Donnell, and he said, the present directors of CRR include Peadar O'Donnell, who was sent in 1926 with 6 students to the Lenin College in Moscow to study the technique of revolution. Moreover, anti-religious propaganda is the cornerstone of the Soviet technique of revolution, to study which Peadar O'Donnell went to Moscow in 1929. The logical outcome of this overthrow of government, according to the Reverend Casey, was the destruction of unimaginable horror for the Irish people. And he said this, incidentally, it is useful to remember that the setting up of the parent Soviet Republic in Russia was affected, according to official Soviet statistics, by the shooting of 1.7 million persons. This is the kind of revolutionary technique which the leader of CRR went to study in 1929. The editorial finished its attack on Sarah and on Peadar O'Donnell by announcing the forthcoming publication of a pamphlet called Whither Ireland that would be available to buy from the Irish Rosary Office in Dublin, and which would account for first-hand experience of small farmers under the crushing weight of the Soviet state. Okay. Whither Ireland was written by Gertrude M. Godden, an English Catholic journalist, folklorist, and anthropologist who took a keen interest in communism in Soviet Russia. By 1932, she had produced a book on the Naga people of northeastern India, a memoir of Henry Fielding, and a hagiography of Benito Mussolini. Written in the first flushes of success after Mussolini's march on Rome, her account of his achievements displayed strong fascist sympathies. The young men are singing the Merry Fascio song on the streets, proclaiming that Italy has found her strength and her unity. Exulting reverence is paid to the dead of her armies who died that Italy might live. The characteristic national desire for all that is beautiful in life has been exalted by the sacrifices of the war into a passionate and patriotic emotion, a determination that Italy shall stand beautiful always, but also strong and respected and self-respecting among the nations. Godden's anthropological study of the Naga people follows in the mold of other racist and imperial studies of the time that purport to be objective science. And she said, "We find a record of the hostility of the tribes as far back as 1832, when English officers, at the head of some native levies, fought their way through the Agamni and Kutcha Nagas. At this time and for many subsequent years, the Nagas made themselves known to us as barbarous savages. The savage virtues of blood feud and relentless raiding and savage ignorance of many of the first principles of higher civilization were everywhere apparent. For 10 years following 1838, they raided our border, engaged in mutual extermination, and defied our efforts to manage them, alike by official tours or punitive expeditions." Godden's work on communism leaned heavily upon the writings of Dr. Edmund Walsh, S.J., the anti-communist advocate and educator at Georgetown University, and other anti-left texts. She was particularly keen to point out the godlessness of Russia and its incompatibility with Catholicism. And here's a pamphlet you can see of Whither Ireland itself, and take a note there of the imprimatur of the Dublin office. Whither Ireland contains the imprimatur of the Irish Church on its opening page, printed opposite the fourth verse of James Clarence Mangan's My Dark Rosaleen, to emphasize the connection between the nation and the church. In its section on Soviet intentions for Irish children, it claims that the Soviet school curriculum includes the premature rousing of sex instincts. Free love is openly applauded. Unnatural relationships amongst the children of the school are encouraged. Such hyperbolic and unsubstantiated claims are mixed with fears about abortion, divorce, and the one particular girl who reported that she'd been married 16 times in a period of 3.5 years. Whither Ireland does not specifically mention details about Irish communism or communists, but it does largely point away to communism had been implemented in Russia and was largely based on Godden's book, Russia Under the Red Flag, a record of socialism in our time, from 1929. The inclusion of an advertisement for Whither Ireland, its availability from the Irish Rosary offices, and the imprimatur of the Archbishop of Dublin, Edward Byrne, were important elements in Peadar O'Donnell's subsequent claim against the Irish Rosary. On the 15th of April 1932, O'Donnell's libel action against Alex Thome and Co., which were the printers, Easons and Sons, the distributors, and the Very Reverend Hyacinth Vincent O'Casey, OP, the publisher, reached the High Court, where he sought damages for repeated libel in the Irish Rosary article and an injunction ceasing publication of the journal until trial. O'Donnell's senior counsel, Mr. Joseph O'Connor, claimed that the alleged libel was shocking and very deliberate, and that he, O'Donnell, had never at any time been to Moscow or any other part of Russia. The justices were Henry Hanra, 1871 to 1946, and John O'Byrne, 1884 to 1954. O'Byrne had worked for the Irish Land Commission and stood on a pro-treaty Sinn Féin ticket in Wexford during the 1922 general election. Both of these roles would have put him directly in conflict with O'Donnell as leader of the Land Annuities campaign and as an anti-treaty agitator. He asked specifically what O'Donnell found libelous in the article, and his counsel responded, the false statement that Peadar O'Donnell was sent with 6 students to the Lenin College in Moscow. Henry Hanna was from an established Belfast family with impeccable unionist credentials. He'd been appointed as a judge in the Irish Free State Court in 1925, but had a reputation for being fair in his treatment of cases regardless of politics. And interestingly, both of these judges were important in a high number of capital cases in Ireland. So that'll tell you something of significance. O'Casey's counsel applied for an adjournment of a week because they had no time to prepare for the case. This was opposed by O'Donnell's counsel on the grounds that the libel would continue to circulate. The adjournment was granted in order to give the accused parties the opportunity of reply. So the case was heard on the 26th of April, 1932, and O'Donnell's counsel read his affidavit in which he contended that it would be impossible to prove the allegations made by the Reverend Casey, as they were untrue and without foundation. He went on to claim that there was a campaign of calumny against O'Donnell being carried on by certain priests, and his name only appeared in print when it was followed by the allegation made in Dáil Éireann by the Minister for Justice that O'Donnell and 6 other students had attended the Lennon College. This allegation had been contradicted by Sean Lamass in the Dáil, and the contradiction had been published in the Dublin morning papers, Unpublished, and the official debates of Dáil Éireann. Despite this, the Reverend Casey had published this libel in the editorial for the Irish Rosy, Dies Sair Air, and again in the pamphlet Wither Ireland. At this point, the counsel for the Reverend Casey interjected to claim that Wither Ireland was an entirely independent publication, and he objected to any extracts being read from it on these grounds, despite it, of course, containing the imprimatur of the Archbishop of Dublin, the official church censor Albert O'Neill OP, and being distributed through the Irish Rosary offices. O'Donnell's affidavit continued to deny any of the claims associated with him, and here's from his statement. I have never carried, nor have I ever intended to carry on anti-Christian propaganda, nor have I ever attempted to set up an anti-Christian state. I am, on the contrary, a Catholic. I've never thought nor inculcated blasphemy, nor have I any intention of doing so in the future. I've never closed, nor have I attempted to close churches. I've never melted church bells. I've never encouraged drunkenness, either among the youth or the adult population, or this or any other country. I am a strict teetotaler and regard alcoholic excess and the evils that attend it as a great obstacle to the achievement of political and economic freedom of this country and the conquering of poverty by the mass of the people. He also rejected the Reverend Casey's claim that his sales would not be adversely affected by the libel and listed his strong Catholic connections. Books by O'Donnell have been adopted by the Catholic Book of the Month and the Catholic Book Lovers Clubs in America, that his books circulated in libraries in Ireland and elsewhere under the control of the Catholic or mainly Catholic selection committees, and that an excerpt from one of his books appears in a reader widely circulated in the Irish national schools, which are under clerical control. Advising that the case could not fall exclusively against the Reverend Casey and must also give equal blame to the other defendants, Justice Hannah O'Byrne claimed that the distributors, Easons, had acted properly in withdrawing the magazine upon becoming aware of the facts. Because of this, he dismissed O'Donnell's application with costs. O'Donnell's counsel must have realised that they were on a weak footing with a class action against all 3 defendants, because they returned to court on the 7th of June 1932 and had dropped the claims against the printers and the distributors. Now the Reverend Casey was the principal defendant, and his defence again brought forward a request for an adjournment of the trial, this time on the grounds that O'Donnell had not fully disclosed certain documents and that they also required to translate published material from Unpublished that had referenced original documents in Russian and in German. In particular, the counsel wished to examine 2 articles written by O'Donnell called An Irishman Answers the Pope, from the organ of the English Communist Party, the Daily Worker, and an account of the Peasants' Congress in Berlin that had been published in the Workers' Voice, the paper of the Communist Party in Ireland. The adjournment was granted subject to the defendants paying the cost of the motion. The case was heard on the morning of the 13th of June, 1932, and opened with His Lordship Justice Hannah remarking that he had only become aware the previous day that Sair Air and the Workers' Farmers Committee were still illegal, and as such, he would not allow any discussion of their constitutions or any discussions in relation to them. This was followed by O'Donnell's counsel repeating the alleged libel and the reputational damage it had inflicted upon him. The defendant denied that the words were defamatory, that they were true in substance and fact, and pleaded fair comment. O'Donnell was the first to take the stand, where he was given vigorous cross-examination by the defendant's counsel. It opened with an accusation that Sair Air was established to overthrow the state and to set up a Soviet-style government in its place. It was followed with the assertion that the bishop's pastoral was in effect a condemnation of the programme of Sair Air as it stood. O'Donnell denied both claims before Justice Hannah interrupted him to ask what his conception of communism was. To which O'Donnell replied, I have never studied communism. The next stage of the trial is perhaps the most interesting aspect from a literary perspective and place it with other infamous libels in Irish literary history. What came to be examined was literature itself and the relationship between the writing and politics and their place within the Irish state. The question of O'Donnell's communism was at the forefront during the trial of the defence. They referred specifically to O'Donnell's article for the Daily Worker, titled The Irishman Answers the Pope, in which O'Donnell took exception to Cardinal MacRory's, the Archbishop of Armagh and Private of Ireland, attack on Soviet Russia as anti-religious. O'Donnell claimed that MacRory's stance was putting a wedge between him and the interests of the people of Ireland by forcing them into supporting a British imperial state in their opposition to Russia. Your Eminence joined the Irish bishops in issuing in 1922 a pamphlet which did more to recruit Irish lads into the service of Britain than ever John Redmond and his party did, though we hounded them out of public life for their deeds. And your Eminence was such a powerful partisan of that party that not even the murder of Irish leaders, whom you knew personally to be loyal members of your flock, halted your imperial drive. O'Donnell's accusation that support for W.T. Cosgrave's government was a de facto support of British imperial interests was echoed by the defence charge against him that support for Soviet Russia was de facto support of anti-religious policies. In this article, O'Donnell makes clear that he stands for the overthrow of the Free State and anyone supporting it. Your recruiting efforts will be smothered and the overthrow of the imperial state will again be attempted in this country. And let me, as a humble Catholic, add that it would be decidedly unfortunate for the Irish state bishops to make themselves again the champions of the imperialist state. I do not think that religion will suffer, but certainly the example set by Mr. Willie Cosgrave in his fine impartiality of attack on Britain's enemies might be copied by resurgent Ireland against hers. Such an open attack and threat to the church and the bishops made uncomfortable reading for O'Donnell in the courtroom and would have been difficult for a Catholic jury. O'Donnell's counsel was so worried about it that it raised it specifically with the jury in order to acknowledge that it was an imprudent letter to write, but at least he was sincere. And they said, that may have been a very foolish letter, and possibly the jury would think that it had been a foolish letter, but was that the action of a man who was supposed to be secretly in the pay and confidence of Soviet Russia would take in order to further his object of installing the principles of Soviet Russia in this country? O'Donnell was then questioned with regards to his links with British communists William Rust and Robert Stewart. And here's obviously William Rust, the editor of the Daily Worker. So Rust was the editor of the Daily Worker, who published O'Donnell's article, and Stewart was a Scottish communist and spy for the Comintern who visited O'Donnell while they were organising peasant committees in Galway. Stewart was originally sent to Ireland by the Communist Party of Great Britain to help organise Jim Larkin's Irish Workers' League and promote its newspaper, The Irish Worker. Stewart was known to the British authorities, who were possibly passing information on him to W.T. Cosgrave's government, which is why Justice Hanna had seemed so informed about his role. And I'll talk a little bit about this in relation to some of the archival stuff that I found later on, because it seems to me that they were very well informed to some degree about Stewart's role in Ireland. Stewart was known as the money man for distributing funds from Moscow for the promotion of communist activities in Britain and Ireland, and had been back and forth between the two states since at least 1924. He'd been initially expelled from Ireland by Jim Larkin on the grounds that he was undermining Larkin's position within the Labour movement and had been reporting to Moscow via the Communist Party of Great Britain. Unbeknownst to the Communist Party of Great Britain, they had an informant within their inner circle who was present at senior meetings. The informant was again possibly Irish, or at least of Irish extraction, as she was able to discuss Republican issues authoritatively and reported to the Superintendent J. MacBreen from the Special Branch of the Metropolitan Police in London. MacBreen's account of Stewart's time in Ireland offered an interesting analysis of the backbiting and paranoia that beset the left in Ireland following the Civil War and their nascent attempts to inculcate a vibrant class consciousness. So I'm going to read from this now, but it's a bit technical, so bear with me. So owing to a letter which he received from the Russian agent in London, Jim Larkin took a trip to London and discussed his grievances with the Soviet agent. The agent took notes of Larkin's complaints against Arthur McManus, which was as follows, according to Larkin's statement. When Larkin signed an agreement in Moscow a few months previous to the meeting, a suggestion was made that he should allow Robert Stewart to go to Dublin to assist him in the organising of Irish workers. To this he assented, but he found that the Communist Party of Great Britain were endeavouring to manoeuvre the control committee funds of the Irish Workers' League by trying to get Larkin's brother Peter to agree to certain proposals. The main charge against Comrade McManus was that he acted in a most cowardly manner in allowing or ordering Stewart to get in touch with a communist in America whose name was O'Flaherty. Now, this is likely Tom Make O'Flaherty, Liam O'Flaherty's brother, who was a known communist agitator and in America. And who was recognized in that country, this is O'Flaherty, as a stool pigeon. Stewart asked him, O'Flaherty, to let him know everything he knew about Larkin, who was constantly receiving letters from this man, slandering him. The object of these letters was that in the event of Larkin breaking with the Communist Party of Great Britain, they were to be used privately by McManus to discredit Jim Larkin. Stuart mislaid one of these letters, which he used to receive in Unity Hall in Dublin, direct from America. Larkin then found the letter and read it. He challenged Stuart about it, and the latter stated that he knew he'd been indiscreet, but that the blame was on Albert Inkpen and Albert McManus, who had instructed him to do so. This was the main reason that Larkin sent Stuart out of Dublin and refused to act in concert with the Communist Party. In a letter to Gregory Zinoev from H.E. Brown, that despite the fact that there was an executive in Dublin and another in London, which bodies were supposed to arrange the activities of the Irish Workers' League, Larkin dictated to both bodies. Though his jealousies, he was retarding the progress of the Irish Workers' League, in as much as he would not allow Bob Stewart nor Willie Gallagher to go to Ireland and assist in the organisation of the Irish Workers' League there. So this is in 1924. It's a long time ago, and they're expelled from Ireland. However, Stewart does return, importantly, for the trial. So Stewart and Willie Gallagher, whom O'Donnell had known from his early IRA days in Scotland, were both excluded from Ireland by Larkin in 24-25. However, by 1928, Soviet Russia had returned to mass collectivization of farms, a policy with lethal consequences for large sections of the peasant workers, and this had led to renewed pressure to attempt to bring communist small farmers' interests in line with their urban counterparts. The result of this was an attempt at the promotion of the Crescentern, the umbrella organization for peasant groups internationally, which would culminate in the European Peasants' Conference in Berlin in 1930. It's a fascinating photo that I found on the internet, so I can't quite give it credit yet, but there, as you can see, Bob Stewart and Peadar O'Donnell, both at the table. So there's O'Donnell and Stewart very distinctively. So Stewart had returned to Ireland in 1929 to establish the peasant committees, build a working infrastructure for reporting, revive the Irish worker, and elect a delegation to travel to Berlin for his proposed conference. It was Stewart who suggested O'Donnell's article be published by the Daily Worker. He had read the original version, which had been published in Unpublished in February of 1930, and I identified it as an excellent piece of propaganda that would sit well with Catholic workers in Great Britain. Stewart's letters, of course, were being opened and copied by British intelligence. And according to a British intelligence report, he was in part control of the Irish Secretariat, also assisting in organising the Irish branch of the Crescentern. So he wrote to the Secretary of the Communist Party of Great Britain from Ireland saying, an article appeared in Unpublished, an open letter to Cardinal MacRory, the reproduction of which, in complete form for circulation by amongst our Catholic workers throughout Great Britain, would be very useful, I think. I think the Daily Worker will have a copy of the publication in question, so you can judge by its contents if you agree with my suggestion. However, during his trial, O'Donnell denied that he knew of his description by Rust, and this is in the article of the Daily Worker, as the sole leading figure in the IRA who has openly identified himself with communist activities in Ireland, and also denied that Stewart had helped him to organise any of the committees, although he did concede that where the means of production, distribution, and exchange are involved, that these things must come under community control. So O'Donnell's disavowal of Stewart here was disingenuous and raises some interesting questions about his actual political ambitions between the start of the Land and Duties campaign and the formation of CRR. It was O'Donnell who was the most receptive to Stewart's activities in Ireland, and he was the one to bring him on his recruiting drive across the Free State. And Stewart wrote to his wife to say, my journey was a cold one indeed. First 6 hours in a bus where I thought I would freeze, but I didn't. I got a good feed at the end of the journey on Sunday. Monday and Tuesday by open motor car, I covered many of the miles into fertile farmlands and made many interesting contacts with the farming population and was kindly and hospitably received. When I see you, I'll tell you all about it in detail. Sufficient to say that our work makes some progress. O'Donnell, who I think called on you, makes a most interesting and helpful travelling companion and is a good writer with great influence among the working farmers. In my journey, I called at known and not so well known towns and villages like Galway, Limerick, Neenah, Castleconnell, Rosscray, Loughrea, etc., etc. So O'Donnell quickly became an obvious choice for a committee member and representative at the Congress, although again he denied this and instead suggested at his hearing that he was chosen to preside at the Peasants' Congress in Berlin because he was a writer of international reputation and came from small farmer stock. So he's very keen to disavow fully his communist connections. So Stewart recognized O'Donnell's skills as a propagandist and at the very least saw an alignment of their political goals. O'Donnell's talents in this and his insight that the Irish peasants would be better organised around anti-imperial discourse rather than a pro-communist one were on display in the pamphlet he produced after returning from the European Peasants' Conference in Berlin in 1930, called The Plan of Campaign for Irish Working Farmers from 1931. Its summation of O'Donnell's attitude to the Free State and its institutions would leave its readers in no doubt about its intentions. He said this: "Today, the press, the army, the police, the jails, the judiciary are all weapons in the hands of the enemies of those who toil to live in Ireland. To free themselves, the masses must ultimately disarm and gag, dig up and destroy the interests of the present state has been created to serve. The Peasants' Council will, therefore, campaign against police terrorism, will demand the release of political prisoners, will campaign around men on the run, and generally for the ideals and courageous struggles of those revolutionary nationalist forces that are struggling to break the British connection and to achieve an Irish Republic and power resting in the working class and the working farmer." So nor was his relationship with Stuart as innocuous as O'Donnell was trying to portray to the jury. If such pamphlets were O'Donnell's own opinion, they were certainly in line with Stuart's thinking on the matter as well. Stuart had already identified O'Donnell as the man within the Republican movement who would be most sympathetic to Kissington's aims. He wrote to O'Donnell's old mentor from Glasgow, Willie Gallagher, asking him to promote Irish issues amongst Protestants in Scotland, and acknowledged that O'Donnell was aligning his republicanism with international communism. And this is what he said to Willie Gallagher: "I've been keeping to interest the farming population on European Congress, and they're likely to be well represented, which will improve matters a little from that angle. The Daily Worker is not bad, but it is difficult to sell here because of the lack of Irish news. I think there's still some Republicans about Glasgow and the West who still read the Public and maintain some connection with the Free State. I've tried to influence the discussion in the Public, but so far only O'Donnell moves perceptibly towards us. But if some of your lads took up the correspondence from Glasgow, it would broaden out. Bad as it is the only half-friendly publication here." So Stuart left an interesting account of his initial time in Ireland during 1924, organising for the Comintern, breaking the fetters from 1963, which includes his meetings with O'Donnell. He was able to bond with O'Donnell and Jim Larkin through their shared abstemiousness, seeing alcohol as the destructive force in the organisation of Labour, although Stuart ultimately blamed Larkin's narcissism for the failure of the Communist Party to flourish in Ireland. It's quite interesting that Stuart noted that there was a temperate streak in Republicans as a whole, and he said, "Their politics were quite progressive and most of them detested the booze. So for me at least, there was this added bond of unity." So however, the question of O'Donnell's political relationship with Stuart was what was being interrogated fully in the trial. O'Donnell was keen to disavow any close ties, yet British intelligence felt that O'Donnell was in the pay of Moscow and the Comintern in order to keep Public floating and to promote radical left-wing views. This would explain the line of questioning by Justice Hanna around the funding of Sarah and O'Donnell's trip to Europe. So in an internal memo, British intelligence claimed, and I find this quite interesting, that Robert Stewart, who was at present in Dublin in favour of starting a paper to take the place of the Irish Worker. Failing to obtain the 700 formerly entrusted to his care by Moscow, he was promised to give a grant of £600 to Unpublic on condition that it gives prominence to left-wing propaganda. He is in touch with Jack Carney in London, who is arranging the dispatch of the money to Peadar O'Donnell. So that's an interesting to think that Unpublic was at some stage taking money from Russia. It's quite likely, although if you think that O'Donnell himself was aligning with this. So the information has been based on the interception of a letter between Stewart and the communist and journalist Jack Carney, who'd been reporting on the Irish situation to Moscow and was also likely funneling money to Stewart and O'Donnell. Carney was a committed supporter of Larkin, although they did have a falling out later on. So it seems unlikely that the money was being paid to O'Donnell without Larkin's consent. However, it is at least possible that Carney was in fact sending the money without Larkin's knowledge, as he was ultimately to support the diversion of funds from Russia to Ireland without his approval. Carney was clear about what the money was for, and he said, "Enclosed find the money, £200, obviously much less, as arranged for Unpublic. Trust it will reach you safely." So O'Donnell's trial at this stage took an interesting turn from a literary point of view. He was asked by the senior counsel of defence, J. Fitzgerald, on what he based his reputation as a writer, and he replied that Islanders from 1928 made a reputation for me. Fitzgerald then asked if he felt that the knife and the gates flew open blasted your reputation irretrievably, to which O'Donnell replied, "That is nonsense." At this point, Justice Hanna intervened to ask O'Donnell directly if he felt that the Antichrist of Maynooth was a proper description of the bishops. What Hannah was referring to here was a passage from O'Donnell's The Knife from 1930, where the protagonist discusses the infamous pastor of the bishops calling on Republicans to withdraw armed action. And it said this: "The priest here won't give any of us absolution when we go to confession. The Antichrist and Maynooth made a new religion to back the treaty, and because we won't give up the Republic or our religion, they won't let a priest near us except giglins like themselves." So Hannah's interjection was followed by a detailed analysis of O'Donnell's works of literature, to which he was called to account for what he had written as fiction, albeit informed by his experiences of the War of Independence and the Civil War. O'Donnell responded that was the kind of talk I heard in prison. I believe it to be quite an improper description. O'Donnell was then drawn to explain the creative process, claiming that the question of shooting the bishops was never in anyone's mind. In this book, he was creating characters in fiction, to which Mr. Fitzgerald replied, "Who is the knife? Is he a real character? Is he speaking your own thoughts?" Fitzgerald then took O'Donnell through The Gates Flew Open from 1932, where he had written that the bishops were the bailiffs in the Lord, and O'Donnell protested that he must deal with politics in his work. Fitzgerald then sarcastically responded, mocking O'Donnell for his artistic pretensions, saying, "You must let your joyous personality find expression." O'Donnell was at this stage exasperated and claimed that he must deal with these matters as an artist, to which Fitzgerald retorted, "An artist in slime, I suggest." The significance of this exchange was that O'Donnell was being called to answer for what was ostensibly fiction, and his reputation as an anti-clerical communist was been evidenced by his fictional writings. That The Gates Flew Open should be regarded by O'Donnell as a work of fiction is perhaps disingenuous. It is written in the first person singular and describes the experiences of the Civil War in detail. Yet there was something unfair in bringing up writing that had been published expressly as a form of consciously created artifice as hard evidence of political opinion. O'Donnell was writing for predominantly English and American market, as his choice of publishers in Jonathan Cape and G.P. Putnam and Sons respectively testifies, and was known outside of Ireland primarily as an author, not as a political agitator. Others in Ireland too saw O'Donnell as a major force in Irish writing, and what happened next at the trial is evidence of this, as O'Donnell's barrister called W.B. Yeats as a witness. Yeats had already been duped at this stage into booking the Abbey Theatre for Sarah Ayres in Orgreave meeting by O'Donnell. And this was an interesting episode Yeats recounts, whereby O'Donnell had called to him to discuss the forthcoming production of his play Rack by the Abbey, and mentioned in passing that he was going to book the theatre. Yeats wasn't aware that it was the booking for Sarah Ayres in Orgreave meeting. But he too had a keen eye for exploiting the potential publicity such a case could make. He also knew exactly what was at stake and that literature itself was on trial, with an author being asked to justify what he'd written in front of the courts. The Censorship of Publications Act from 1929 had taken greater prominence in Yeats's thoughts as its implications became clear, as he had sought to counteract its influence by the creation of an Irish Academy of Letters. So the Irish Academy of Letters was formally proposed 3 months later, on Sunday the 19th of September 1932, at a public meeting in the Abbey's Peacock Theatre. And with his typical dramatic flair, Yeats announced its inauguration in the papers the day before, in which he published a list of members, potential members, without those members being consulted. And it planned to help pack the house by accompanying its announcement with a lecture titled The New Ireland. So seeing the implications of O'Donnell's trial and an opportunity to get some early press coverage for the proposed academy, Yeats took to the stand. As Yeats must have known, the exchange was widely covered in the local and national papers, and his presence brought some levity to bitter proceedings. Although Yeats himself was serious about the importance of art and did his best to support O'Donnell as an artist, the sight of the notoriously effete Yeats defending such a dangerous radical as O'Donnell on the grounds of artistic license was too much for some in the courtroom to bear. They said, and here's an account of it. Mr. W.B. Yeats, examined by Mr. O'Connor KC, said he was always a supporter of the late government. Replying to his lordship, witness said he did not read all of the plaintiff's books. He thought the plaintiff was a novelist of great promise. He had a fine English style, had imaginative sensitiveness, and a great knowledge about the form of life about which he wrote. Witness mentioned that the assistance of Mr. Shaw, he was trying to form an Irish Academy of Letters. He hoped to have the plaintiff as one of its members. That did not mean that he was in any way concerned with the plaintiff's politics. In reply to Mr. O'Connor, witness said that as far as the Irish public in America was concerned, the sale of the plaintiff's book would be injured. He could not say if there would be an increase among the other classes of readers. Replying to Mr. Fitzgerald, said that he did not think The Knife was on a level with Mr. O'Donnell's earlier novels. He wished very much that Mr. O'Donnell would devote his interest entirely to his novels and leave politics for a pastime in his old age, to which there was laughter. Mr. Fitzgerald said, if you can get him to do that, you will be doing him a great service. So with Yates's testimony, the witness for the plaintiff were concluded, and the counsel for the defence could call its witnesses. The first person called was a Dr. Charles Gardner, an old friend of O'Donnell's from Dunlow. O'Donnell had taken time to provide extra tuition to Gardner's sons as they were preparing to take an entrance exam for the Diocesan College. Dr. Gardner took the stand reluctantly, as he was a friend of O'Donnell's for 30 years and held him in high esteem. He claimed that O'Donnell had told him in passing conversation in 1930 that he'd been to Soviet Russia. Gardner's son, who was an ecclesiastical student and admitted to being contacted directly by the defendant, the Reverend Casey, said he'd also heard O'Donnell speaking of Russia. O'Donnell told the witness that, I am going to start another revolution, and he'd been to Italy and Russia as part of the International Peasants Association, where he had been smuggled between the countries. Finally, the defence called Hugh Allen, an assistant secretary to the Catholic Truth Society and the editor of the Catholic Mind. He recalled that he had a conversation with O'Donnell, who said to him that, and this is a quote, the mistake that O'Donnell and his party had made in 1922 was they did not shoot every bishop, beginning with Logue of Armagh and ending with Kelly of Ross. O'Donnell's defence tried to discredit these witnesses by showing that they were deeply connected to the Catholic hierarchy and therefore were violently anti-communist, but this would have succeeded only in reinforcing the impression that their client was one. O'Donnell did not help his case by remaining politically active in the build-up to the trial. He appeared with Maud Gonne and Frank Ryan on a platform in Cattlebrewer Street in Dublin 3 days before his court hearing under the joint auspices of the People's Rights Association and the Women Prisoners Defence League. So, in his summation of the case, Justice Hannah directly contradicted the arguments of the plaintiff's counsel and was keen to point out that the truth of the statement that he, O'Donnell, went to Moscow under the circumstances of which he complained was irrelevant. What was to be established was whether it was libelous to say that he did. Was it defamatory of a man who held a position in this country that the plaintiff admitted he held in the forefront of illegal revolutionary movements? Was it libel on him to say that he would go to Russia to study such things? Justice Hannah also felt justified in his decision to prohibit discussions of illegal organisations in the course of the case, something that O'Donnell's counsel had wanted to do to show that the constitution of Sair Air was not communist. However, Justice Hannah did not finish there with leading the jury in considering their verdict. He went on to completely discredit O'Donnell as a witness and to undermine his right to take the case, and this is what he said. My complaint about Mr. O'Donnell as a witness is that he seemed to be evasive. I don't think he was candid. He very seldom answered a question directly in the sense of being straight. I wanted to get his view about communism and to know if he was a communist. I'm not satisfied as to what his objection to Russia was. He's very clever, he's a subtle mind, and is full of imagination. But all of these qualities do not make a man a convincing witness. I suggest that the weakness in Mr. O'Donnell's able speech to you is that he forgot who Peadar O'Donnell is. His energy, his ability, his determination, his ruthlessness, and unfortunately his lawlessness. He does not pretend to be a law-abiding man. So, however, as if to highlight the most damning evidence against O'Donnell had come from his writings, Justice Hannah finished his closing statement with an attack on literature and an affirmation of the need for state censorship. What do you think about the statements he made about the clergy of his church? No decent member of any church would refer to the clergy of his church in the words that Mr. O'Donnell had put in the mouths of some of his characters. In the last book plaintiff wrote, there were some dreadful passages. This was supposed to be a censorship of literature in this country, but the statements read out in that book would disgrace the literature of any continental country he knew of. It might be that the vile words put into the mouths of the characters were put in by a man with a clean mind. You can disagree with the people by the eminence of bishops without descending to such a level as would be used in the Coombe by a woman of low position and humble rank, who would be brought before the magistrates and five bob for using language that appeared in some of the books. So the Justice's final statement is interesting on a number of levels, as it points to the paternalism, misogyny, xenophobia, class difference, and reactionary Catholicism, although Justice Hannah himself was not a Catholic, so embedded within Irish society. Although interestingly, this wasn't the first time that Hannah had led the jury on a number of issues relating to Catholicism or in his defence of Catholicism. And you can see Liam O'Callaghan's work on that. So it may have been the case that O'Donnell and other left-wing Republican communists felt this was an important test case in the courts for radical groups, but the case was completely misjudged in light of the forces united against it. The jury retired, found that there was no libel, and judgment was entered accordingly for the defendant. They found in effect that the words complained of were not defamatory and were true and in substance and fact, and that the Reverend Casey's article was fair comment. despite there being no evidence for O'Donnell having been to Russia. So the importance of the trial was not lost on Yates, who was a Free State senator, took some personal risk in appearing to support O'Donnell. The threat of political violence had not left Irish politics entirely by 1932, although the IRA leadership were cognizant of O'Donnell's efforts and increasingly encouraged its officers to take up agitation on social justice issues. So Yates's presence at the trial does mark a shift in O'Donnell's fortunes as well, with his literary endeavours taking a more prominent role in his life as the decade proceeded. With the formation of Saor Éire in 1931 and the moves by Fianna Fáil to alleviate the difficulties of small farmers and the urban poor, O'Donnell was also operating in a difficult political reality. The rise of the blue shirts in Ireland and fascism in Europe increasingly attracted his attention, and the sidelining of Republicans by the Fianna Fáil administration, the continued suppression of revolutionary groups, meant that radicals like O'Donnell were being starved of political sympathy and outmaneuvered by wider historical events. To be fair to O'Donnell, he saw all of this clearly, and he's one of Ireland's most vocal critics of fascism, both at home and abroad. His experiences in the Spanish Civil War will be memorably captured in Salute an Irishman in Spain from 1936, and it showed he remained a public figure in his continued clashes with the Catholic Church. It is also to Yates's credit that he saw in O'Donnell the qualities that made his writings popular and relevant. That Yates could use O'Donnell's try to promote his proposed Academy of Letters and to demonstrate the need to defend literature from the forces of suppression and censorship was an added bonus. He was in no doubt that the trial was calling into question an artist's right to self-expression, and O'Donnell's presence in the final list of the members of the Academy is evidence of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. You will take questions, yeah?
Yeah, sure. We're happy to, yeah. I'll just grab some water. That's okay.
So yes, I will walk into those questions. Liam.
Yeah, a tiny question to start off. Did Peadar O'Donnell use the term peasants? I noticed you moved between working farmers and Irish peasants.
Yes, I think he did. I'll have to go and double check that, but I think he used peasants and he often used working farmers, small farmers. It's Richard English's work from '95, I think. He talks a lot about O'Donnell's sense of neighbourliness, which he used a lot to kind of inform his concept of communism/socialism. So O'Donnell's political outlook is not entirely clear at any one point, and I think it's complicated by his Catholicism, and that comes out in the military pension archives, which were people remembering O'Donnell as despite being Catholic, a communist, being Catholic also. So I think he does use the word, but he also uses the word working farmers. He used the word ranchers for big farmers.
So it's a fascinating story, but I just wanted to ask the really obvious question. What does O'Donnell hope to gain by taking this action? I mean, given the number of skeletons he's covered, some are of them with Rebecca Party.
Yeah.
Was he seeking to make a political point, or was he in fact concerned about his career as an author, hoping to somehow deflect criticism?
My own feeling, I don't know is the answer to that. My own feeling is that this is a test case and he's hoping for some degree of publicity around it. I can't see how he could have thought that he would have won it, unless, of course, he's failing to make the distinction between, libel and the truth, right? So, I mean, he must have been certain that there was no evidence of him going to communist Russia or studying communist techniques of communist Russia. But whether he felt that he had a strong enough case for libel. So my own suspicion is that it was taken as some sort of publicity stunt, but I really not 100% sure on that yet. I started out my research looking at the Irish Academy of Letters. I wanted to look at it from a literary point of view to write a proposed monograph on the topic. But I had to kind of address O'Donnell very early on because of the trial, as one of the early examples of where the Academy is mentioned and Yates being called to it. And then I had to keep on going back and back further into his life. And during lockdown, the National Archives of Kew opened all their digital archives for free. So I was able to get some very interesting information, including what looks like, some evidence here to say that on public at some stage was in receipt of money from Russia, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure is the answer to that.
And what were the financial consequences? I mean, was it a costly venture for him?
It doesn't come out, and I don't know where he's getting his money from. So Pat O'Donnell's wife is independently wealthy. I think she had a lot of shares in Pi, which you'll see come up in the Bell, which advertises for Pi a lot. And like a lot of good communists, Pat O'Donnell had independent means. He's a very interesting figure at this point. He's quite revolutionary. He's still on the run. He's the #1 enemy of the state. James Hogan writes, could Ireland become communist, which has O'Donnell as its target, and he, including. But I mean, one of our PhD students come across some evidence in Mary Manning's archive in America that he might have had an affair with Mary Manning at the Gate Theatre at this point, potentially, which is interesting. But Pat O'Donnell burnt all his own letters, so we don't have a lot of information on him. But I suspect he was using any funds that were handed to him cash-wise, independently from this. So I guess it was paid for by somebody within the IRA or within on public funds in that context. Yeah.
Great, thanks. That was really fascinating. It's kind of a big question, but I'm wondering to what extent this is maybe not about communism, but it's part of a kind of a wider culture war that's going on in the 1930s, in which communism is signifying something to do with freedom and an attempt to sort of redefine the state as essentially a Catholic state. If you step outside that consensus, it's made clear your career or your livelihood will be harmed. I see a lot of something I've been researching recently is the Frank Edwards case. I think it's the following year when Frank Edwards is a member of Sarah Eyre. He's a school teacher who's basically fired by the bishop in Waterford, and he mounts a kind of quite thorough sort of campaign, which initially gets the support of his trade union, the teachers union, and interestingly gets quite a lot of grassroots support to basically say, look, it's your right to be a left-wing Republican and be in sort of public employment. But basically, he loses that struggle. He is fired. So I just wonder, is it too much to draw all this together and say this is kind of a culture war and communism is the
You're absolutely right. I think that's entirely correct. The Irish Academy of Letters is set up as an international body, right? And once you start to look at those members that are outside of it, it immediately draws into question what is Irishness. Like right up to the 60s with say McGahern afterwards getting fired from the teacher's post. What's fascinating about the trial is the degree to which the Reverend Hyacinth isn't questioned at all. Bringing witnesses that are your own ecclesiastical students, bringing witnesses that are from the editors of the Catholic Mind, all of this. When he says he doesn't know who Gertrude Godden is, that's entirely unbelievable, right? You couldn't. It's impossible. It has the imprimatur. It's been published by the Irish. He's the editor of the Irish Rosary. She's an established Catholic, English Catholic. Also, he must have known who he was getting. So yes, I think it is an attempt. I mean, I was quite shocked, even with Justice Hannah, who was from a big house unionist family, kind of leading on a feigning sort of shock at the Catholicism, the injustices to the questioning of the priests. So I do think you're right. I think it's probably part of much wider cultural war, one in which the Irish Academy of Letters is set up to resist. Now, the Academy, interestingly, was already in W.B. Yeats's mind since at least as early as the Abbey Theatre, right? He wanted to come back and start a national theatre, but he also wanted to start establishing an academy. But it's interesting that it's only by 1932 that he really feels that there has to be something done. And the first case they take is George Bernard Shaw's Black Girl in Search of God, which of course is banned. And it's the lack of an appeal process that confounds them. And the minister is advised not to allow any appeal on this one or give any leeway because he's just brought in the legislation for the censorship. And if they grant leeway on this, then the floodgates will open. So I think you're right. It probably is part of a broader, opposition. So one of the things that happens to the Academy when it's announced is that there's a Jesuit goes on the campaign against it. He takes to the road, engaging and saying it's not Irish, it's not Catholic, and it's not even literature. How can it be national? And you can read his his sermons that come afterwards, you know, and they're very well received. It's something that we really don't kind of get a sense of. You know, he was selling out packed audiences to listen to, you know, his view on literature, whereas, you know, there was always with these things are a much more minority concern, I think. So I think you're probably right.
Great. I mean, one of the things that struck me with the Edwards case was how the police and the church seem to collaborate together, swapping intelligence and so on, which, you know, in a sort of a notional Republican ethos is absolutely mad. But that seemed to go on in a fairly
for sure. And I mean, judging by the archival work from the Q, like I'm convinced that Justice Hannon was getting some information about you know, English communists, Scottish communists, you know, the Communist Party of Great Britain. I found very interesting information about O'Donnell, for example. O'Donnell's brother was involved in a raid on the coining estates. They took their rent books, and his family was much more actively involved earlier on. And I think I have some sort of tentative evidence to suggest that both O'Donnell's brothers were in London working at, there's a steel plant there called Acre, I think, and it had it was just a front for communist Russia. So it's a much broader international. There's a lot of conflicting concerns. You know, Stuart is very, when you're looking back, thinking, well, actually, we had to tie this. Like, the communism was never really the issue. We had to tie it to something else in Ireland to make it work, and it never really worked in that way. So, you know, I think there's quite fluid exchange afterwards. Anyone else? Okay.
I think someone online. One second. Marianne Elliott.
Oh, right. Very nice.
Hello, Niall. Can you hear me?
Hi, Marianne. How are you?
Took me a while to get into this because I don't use Teams. Great paper. Thank you very much, and lovely seeing you again.
Lovely to hear from you.
Such an interesting character, O'Donnell. What I wanted to ask you is this: in view of his famous or notorious anti-clericalism, did he attract much support from Protestant trade unionists in the Republic? He did in the North. He did try to. He was very upset in the North that, you know, all the Republicans were more or less like a band of Catholics who would flop on their knees to say the rosary at the. But what happened in the Republic? Did he?
So my understanding is that he did have a lot of sympathy from Protestant union workers, and in fact, one of the things I did uncover about him is that he had been. It's in the pension archives. He had been at a very early age to Scotland, where Willie Gallagher was a kind of mentor to him, and so that's where he'd started off a lot of his work. I think he was taken back and forth bombs probably from Scotland. So yeah, he did seem to get a lot of support. I mean, one of the things I will say about Pat O'Donnell that is evident is that on a personal level, he was incredibly charismatic and everybody liked him or seemed to like him. It was just that his politics were never clearly fully defined. So he was unique, I think, in his ability to negotiate both across class divides, power divides. You know, he was very charming when he was with jury members, for example, if any time he was on trial. So, and that included when he was being tried, you know, for during the Civil War. So I think yes, I mean, there isn't much evidence that really, I mean, the problem with workers in Ireland, broadly speaking, is about, I think, that sectarian divide again, that they just can't bridge the sectarian divide to get a kind of unified consensus.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Marianne. Somebody else wants to come in?
He's not as well informed the question as my esteemed colleagues here. It's not my area at all, but just because you mentioned it, he was a Catholic therefore. And why do you think of James Connolly still ultimately never opposed or took last strikes or whatever? So you've got the common to most finance leftists
Yeah.
in Irish history. Is there any pragmatism to what they're doing there? That it's the sheer power of the church, or is it genuine enough? I mean, I don't really know.
Well, I suspect in O'Donnell's case it is genuine.
Yeah.
His wife, Elil, makes a very impassioned defense of him. She writes to say it's a slander on him to say he's not Catholic. He's deeply Catholic. I mean, I just don't know how he was trying to square the circle. I mean, I think ultimately, if the state that he'd envisioned happened, he wouldn't have been able to some degree, because there would have to have been resistance to the church, unless, of course, he wanted to, just separate them out entirely. But I think on a personal level, he had a deep Catholic faith. I mean, it's interesting because obviously within the academy, there's a lot of secular views. My reading of that period and into the 1960s, even a lot of major figures, Kate O'Brien is an interesting example. As a writer, she's deeply Catholic. Even though her sexuality and her gender puts her outside of what the Catholic Church is teaching, her own personal faith seems to me to be quite strong. So, I know Ivor Walsh talks about her as a lapsed Catholic, but I think it's hard to get a read on that. But I think the culture and the society stuff was just super saturated. And to think really to break those bonds is a huge leap, for a lot of them, and just wouldn't be done.
This is less a question than a kind of perhaps a relevant anecdote. I was looking at letters to Craig here in 1922, in June 22, and most of them are coming from Fermanagh, but some of them are coming from near Strabane. And one of his kind of local unionist supporters says, we were quite an interesting chap here who was poking his nose and everything. And it's Peadar O'Donnell. So it's kind of quite odd that he's operating on the new Irish border in 22 and writing letters to people close to Craig. And he doesn't seem to be, he doesn't seem to be on active service.
Well,
some of both treaty sides are operating, but he's involved in this kind of peace committee.
Yeah, he was involved. I think he was involved in that. One of the things about that committee, so I think the command was basically taken from him because he seemed to be terrible at actually organizing, despite the fact that he was a great commander. So he was very eloquent. He was a very engaged speaker, but they had to send some of the harder units up to the north because they thought the Northern Command was weak. But he was very brave in the Anglo-Irish War. He led a number of attacks on, troop trains and stuff like that, and military camps in Derry, which, he was shot himself. He's much more radical in his early phase than is.
It's quite odd, isn't it, that he's talking directly to unionists.
This is what I find unusual about Peadar O'Donnell. He's a remarkable. He seems to have a remarkable ability to rise above any personal harm or injury or claims, and he seems to be able to talk to everyone on their level. So, as I said, he was remarkably charismatic. So I think and great public speaker, but he's a very hard figure to really pin down in terms of what his politics were.
Who did the painting?
Harry Kernoff, another Irish communist. So that's a Kernoff painting of O'Donnell. So they're all moving in those circles.
Thanks for giving us a really, really interesting paper.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. We're so glad we had you.
Well, thank you very much.